Well, good evening, everybody. My name is Phil Kern, and I'm the board vice president. And one of my roles is to schedule these speaker series. And before we begin, I'd like to have everybody mute themselves and also mute or stop video. That will help the system. All right. Also, I've got a couple of announcements here for Centerville-Washington history. And the first one is the newest exhibit that we're going to have. It's called A Sense of Strength, Incredible Local Ladies from History. And they'll feature the following 5 outstanding women: Massey Hole, Ida Weller, Pauline Polly Webster, Ethel Winterhalter, and Shirley Hines. Learn about these ladies, learn how these ladies made a difference in the history of Centerville and Washington Township. This exhibit is located at the Asheville Wright Museum, which is on North Main Street, and will be ready for viewing when the museums are open to the public. Also, Walk Among the Tombstones and Hunting for History are 2 outdoor self-guided activities that can be enjoyed with family and friends. Come and get some exercise as well as learn a little bit about the history of the local community. Last fall, we did cemetery restoration over at the Sugar Creek Cemetery. We cleaned the tombstones, and we still have more to do. So this spring, we are going to do it again. So watch for the announcement watch the details on our Centerville website. Right now, the museums are still closed. And as soon as we have any updates on when they'll reopen, I'll let you know, and you can we'll let you know, and then you can check our webpage as well. Tonight, our guest speaker is Tim Gaffney. Tim was a Dayton Daily News reporter for 28 years until his retirement in 2006. He's authored 16 books, both national and international, with topics ranging from children's picture books to local brewing history. He is a volunteer trustee of the U.S. Air and Trade Show, which is called the Dayton Air Show. He currently lives in Miamisburg with his wife, Jean, and his grown children and 2 grandchildren. Tim now will talk about the history of beer brewing in the Miami Valley, the brewers who created a thriving industry in the region from the time it was settled in the 1790s until Prohibition, the temperance leaders, and how Prohibition destroyed the region's robust brewing industry. Tim, welcome, and look forward to your presentation here.
Okay, well, thanks, Phil, for having me, and thanks everybody for zooming in. This is a first for me. I've done a lot of book talks over the years, but I've never done a virtual book talk. So it's going to be new. There might be some rough edges, but it should be, and hope it'll be an interesting evening for you. Like Phil said, I live here in Miamisburg. I'm actually in my basement right now. These are not my beer taps, though. This is actually a green screen behind me, and what you're seeing is a picture I took a couple of years ago of the beer taps at Star City Brewing, which is one of our local brew pubs here in Miamisburg. In fact, it's just a couple of blocks away from me. So again, that's not what my basement really looks like. But I'm going to talk for about 20 minutes, tell you a little bit about the brewing history of Dayton and the Dayton area. One of the things that got me interested in writing this book was as we started seeing the brew pubs opening and this resurgence in the craft beer movement in the Dayton area in the last decade, I started noticing that the brewers were latching on to local history and local culture as a way of branding their products and even their brew pub. The way that they were leveraging local history to promote themselves, both as a local product and as a part of the community, made me start thinking more about the history of brewing in the Miami Valley and got me curious about what went on here before the new brewers came along. There were never any brewers in the Dayton area when I was growing up here. So what went before and what happened to them? So I started looking into it and decided to write this book about the history of brewing in the Miami Valley. My book covers about 7 or 8 counties in the Dayton region. It goes from here in Dayton and Miamisburg up to Wapakoneta and over to Minster and over to Springfield. But for tonight, I'm just going to talk about the breweries right here in Dayton. So let me switch over. I have some slides to show, some historical beer pictures. So let me switch to that and get going here. And I believe that you should be seeing my title screen. Does that look right, Phil? Okay.
Yes, yes, it does.
Okay. So there we go. All right. This is a drawing of George Newcomb's Tavern. That was Dayton's first permanent structure. Some of you might be familiar with it. The original Newcomb's Tavern is preserved at Dayton Historical Park. It was built in 1796. In my research for the book, I found that breweries here in Dayton weren't far behind. I'm gonna see if I can, okay, never mind. Brewing was one of the Miami Valley's earliest industries, along with farming and milling. I found one local history of Springfield that said its first settlers had a brewery by 1804. That's the earliest mention of a brewery I found in the Miami Valley. In Xenia, one account named a settler who built a brewery in 1805. Historical accounts of Piqua mention a distiller who also had a brewery between 1807 and 1812. And in Dayton, Newcomb added a brewery to his tavern about 1810. Dayton might not have had the first brewery in the region, but over the course of the 19th century, it had by far the most breweries. Trying to remember which brewery was where got so confusing that I had to make a map. Because of problems with scale and orientation, not to mention gaps in different maps, I used Photoshop to combine elements of maps from 1869 and 1875. Then I pinpointed the location of each brewery as well as I could. Some were actually drawn right on the maps. Others only had a general description of their location and clues to help me track them down. But the map wasn't perfect, but it gave me a good sense of where the breweries were in relation to their local surroundings and each other, even though they existed at different times over the course of a century. I actually printed a copy of the map for my book talks. It's about 40 inches wide. But if you look in the sidebar, you should find a copy that I uploaded that you can download for your own personal reference. It's letter size, so you should be able to print it right out if you want to. Now, after Newcomb, this was Newcomb's brewery. His tavern and brewery were originally here in downtown, and my cursor should be circling that location on the map. Is that right,
It is,
Phil?
it is. Yes, it is.
Okay. After Newcomb, Henry Brown had a brewery right about here in 1820. It was Dayton's first brick brewery, and it was later called the Dayton Brewery. It had a series of owners, and in 1828, it was moved to a new building on the west side of Jefferson, midway between First and Monument. Now, in 1829, John W. Harries brought his family from Wales to New York, and from there to Dayton. They came by way of Cincinnati, and they were among the first travelers to travel on the Miami and Erie Canal. Harries bought the Dayton Brewery, and he owned it until his death in 1873. It made him one of Dayton's longest serving brewers. And by the way, Harries was Welsh, and he was about the only brewer I found in Dayton or the Miami Valley who was not either a German immigrant or a first generation descendant of German immigrants. Almost all the breweries in the Miami Valley came from Germany or were here only one generation separate. But after Harries died in 1873, his son Charles took over, but he didn't seem to have the same gift his father had, and the brewery closed after just 4 years. Now, another early brewery was Riddle's Brewery. And this brewer was James Riddle. He was a Pennsylvania native who had been a mounted ranger in the Indiana wilderness during the War of 1812. I wasn't able to learn when he arrived in Dayton. It may have been 1820 or even earlier, but the records do show that he had a brewery here at least by 1840. I wasn't able to learn much about Riddle. I learned more about the brewer he hired. And that was Henry Fernending. Henry Fernending was a German who immigrated to Baltimore around 1833. A few years later, he decided to come to the Miami Valley. So he set off on foot, walking roughly 200 miles from Baltimore to the Ohio River at Pittsburgh. He most likely took the new National Road for most of that stretch. From Pittsburgh, he floated down the Ohio River to Cincinnati, and he moved up to Dayton and then worked in several towns between Dayton and Cincinnati for a number of years before taking a job in Riddle's Brewery in 1840. Fernending eventually bought the brewery and built a successful business in brewing, malting, and eventually real estate. He became a local business leader and a major benefactor to St. Mary's Institute, which we now know as the University of Dayton. His descendants, and I thought this would be of interest to you folks in Washington Township, his descendants founded the Fernending Insurance Company in Washington Township, and the family still runs it. In January 1848, another German immigrant came to Dayton on foot in stocking feet, according to biographical sketches. Nick Thomas landed in America at New Orleans and came up the Mississippi and Ohio rivers in 1847 to Cincinnati. From there, he walked to Dayton in the winter of 1848 with his boots on his back. Now, his biographical sketches don't explain why he was carrying his boots instead of wearing them, but my guess is that the boots were new and hurt his feet. And having grown up on a farm, I assume he had pretty tough feet. So he may have been used to walking barefoot even in the winter. He only stopped in Dayton to work for a couple of weeks and then went on up to Decatur, Indiana, where an uncle of his had a farm. And on the left side, I made a little path from Cincinnati up to Dayton, and then from Dayton up to Minster along the Miami and Erie Canal, which I understand is the route he took, and then on to Decatur. And I don't know the exact route, but just the straight line distance is over 90 miles from Dayton. So it was quite a hike. Eventually he returned to Dayton, where he worked different jobs until 1880 or 1881, when he bought a brewery here called the Hydraulic Brewery. It was located on East First Street at North Beckel, and that is up in the Front Street area, if you're familiar with that at all, in Dayton. Thomas was in his mid-50s by then, which was old age in the late 1800s. But it was just the start of his real career. By 1906, Nick Thomas was a popular brand name, and his brewery was Dayton's biggest. Now, what was beer like back then? Early American brewers mainly made ales and porters, from what I can tell from my research. They brewed in open kettles, and those open kettles allowed yeast to settle, any kind of yeast to settle out of the air. And it would get into the brew and even colonize the beer barrels. An 1880 book describes it this way. Outside the larger cities, even 20 years ago, ale was almost sure to be dull and muddy and very apt to be sour. So that could well be describing what folks here in Dayton were drinking back in that time period. But change was on the way. In 1859, Henry Fernanding moved his city brewery from Kenton Street to Warren. Now this picture shows the Warren Street Brewery in later years. It was built for brewing a new kind of beer. It was one that had to be brewed carefully and then fermented and stored in cold temperatures. It was lager beer, and its crisp, clear taste was transforming the beer industry in Dayton and across the country. Most historians say lager beer didn't reach the United States until about 1840, and it took a dozen more years for it to get to Montgomery County. By most accounts, Montgomery County's first lager was brewed here at the Wayne Street Brewery, or the Oregon Brewery as it was first known. It was started by John and Michael Schimmel, two brothers from Bavaria, where lager beer was first brewed. Historical accounts say they brewed their first batch of lager in December 1852. John Schimmel died in 1858. Michael Schimmel kept the brewery until his death until 1892. It became known as the Wayne Street Brewery and later the Pioneer Brewery. And it was known as the Pioneer Brewery until it closed in 1900. That brewery is long gone, but it stood at Wayne and Hickory, which is just up Wayne from the Branch and Bone brewery is today. This is a sketch of Coelestin Schwind. Coelestin was one of four brothers who also came from Bavaria in the late 1840s. The two oldest brothers, Joseph and Titus, immediately started their own breweries, Joseph in Dayton with the Main Street Brewery, and Titus, for reasons I haven't learned, up in Troy. Coelestin was the third brother. He and Anton, the youngest, worked for Titus up in Troy and then Joseph. But then Coelestin, according to later accounts, did something that would change his career and the history of brewing in Dayton. In the early 1850s, He spent 11 months working for the Schimmel brothers before starting his own business, the Canal Brewery, just a few blocks from his brother's Main Street Brewery. Coaleston only brewed common beer here, as it was called, but in 1868, he began building a big new brewery on the west bank of the Miami River, just south of what's now Salem Avenue. It was called the Dayton View Brewery, and it was named for the upscale neighborhood growing up around it. The new brewery produced lager beer. Lager beer and later real estate made Coaleston a wealthy man, and the Schwinns became one of Dayton's leading families in the late 19th century. In 1912, the 11-story Schwinn Tower went up on Ludlow Street, one of Dayton's first high-rises. It carried the family name for a century until it was demolished just in 2013. Now, the Schwinn family is important not just because of what the men did. Joseph Schwinn married another immigrant from his hometown in Germany, Agnes Wenner. After Joseph died in 1867, Agnes continued to run the business until about 1882, when it seemed to go out of business. Agnes Wenner Schwinn was the first woman brewery proprietor that I found in Dayton. Yet she received none of the recognition or credit that male business owners or male brewers received. I had to dig her story out of various public records. In fact, she was one of 7 women brewery owners or brewing company owners that I found in my research. Another was Coaleston's wife, Christina. Christina Latin was another Bavarian immigrant. She married Coaleston in 1856, early in his brewing career. Coaleston incorporated his brewery in 1892 with himself as president and his eldest son, Edmund, as vice president. Coaleston died then a year later, but Edmund didn't replace him. No president was identified until 1895 when Christina was named. She held the position for 5 years, and she was the first woman to be president of an incorporated brewing company here in Dayton. Agnes Wenner and Christina Latin made another big difference in Dayton's brewing history. They were the first of some important family ties that would see Dayton's brewing industry dominated by a single group of tightly intertwined families. Agnes's nephew, Louis Wenner, would build one of Dayton's biggest breweries. Christina Schwinn's sister, Mary Latin, married someone who would create Dayton's biggest name in brewing, Adam Schantz. Adam Schantz Sr. was born in Germany in 1839. He immigrated in 1855 with 3 of his brothers. This picture is a monument of Adam that overlooks the family plot at Woodland Cemetery. Adam Schantz learned the meat business and eventually built a fortune in meat, beer brewing, and real estate. He had interest in numerous local companies, and he began the development of Schantz Park in Oakwood. But in the late 1860s, he was still building his meat business when his youngest brother George arrived. And you're keeping all these names straight, right? Because there's a quiz at the end. George went to work in Coaleston Schwinn's brewery across Salem from Adam's slaughterhouse. He eventually became the brewery's foreman, but in 1882, George bought the slaughterhouse and turned it into his own brewery. He called it the Riverside Brewery. Now this photo shows the Riverside Brewery in the early 1900s. The Riverside, it overlooked the city from the west bank of the Miami River, north of Salem Avenue. The Riverside Brewery was a hit right from the start, and it grew rapidly. Its output soon eclipsed the Schwinn's Dayton View Brewery and the Riverside Brewery became a prominent landmark. Now, you might think this would have caused a family crisis. Here was the brother-in-law of Christina Schwinn's sister, the former foreman of her husband's brewery, building another brewery right across Salem Avenue from the Schwinn Brewery. But I found no sign of any rift between the Schaunces and the Schwinns. In fact, I found just the opposite. Just 5 years later, George Schaunce sold his interest in the Riverside Brewery to his brother Adam and teamed up with one of Coaleston's nephews, Louis Schwinn, to build yet another brewery. It was called the Gem City Brewery and also known as the Schaunce and Schwinn Brewing Company. It stood on South Perry Street near where the RTA bus barn is today. Now, I mentioned before that Louis Winter was the nephew of Agnes Winter Schwinn. Louis Winter worked as secretary of the Schaunce and Schwinn Brewery, but in 1901, he quit to start a brewery of his own. Backed by investors, he built the Winter Brewery in the new Edgemont neighborhood, just west of the river and south of Albany Street. Now, remember I said, and this is just in case I haven't thrown enough names at you, I said Adam Schaunce started out in the meat business. Well, he learned butchering from a man named Michael Olt. Michael Olt's sister, Barbara Olt, later married one of Adam's brothers. One of Michael's nephews went to work at the Riverside Brewery. Another joined the Schaunce and Schwinn Brewery, and their sister, Mary Eva Olt, married another Schaunce, Adam Schaunce Jr. So the Olts became closely intertwined with the Schaunces, the Schwinns, and the Winters. Now, I'll talk about a couple other Dayton brewers. There were a few others that weren't connected with the Schaunce, Schwinn, Winter, and Olt families, but I only have time to mention a couple. So I'll just do that quickly. And one was Saxe Pruden. Edward Saxe and David Pruden were both Dayton natives who were born in the 1850s. Edward developed an interest in drugs and medicinal beverages, especially extracts of ginger root. He went into business with David Pruden, and their ginger ale extract sold nationwide to druggists and bottlers. In 1888, they decided to brew real ale. They formed the Saxe Pruden Ale Company and built a big new brewery on Wyandotte Street along the canal. In this historical photo, looking north up the canal, you can see the Saxe Pruden Brewery on the right with the tall chimney. So try to keep a visual image of that for the next picture. But Saxe and Pruden may have made a fatal mistake. They didn't brew lager beer. The company only lasted a few years. David Pruden quit the brewing business, and Edward Saxe spun off his ginger ale work. The building itself survived under owners who used it for other purposes. This is how the Saxe Pruden building looks today. It was the home of Howard Music for many years, and today it houses the Dayton Metro Library offices. Of all Dayton's 19th century breweries, Saxe Pruden is the only one whose brew house is still standing. The other brewery I want to mention is the Hollenkamp Brewery, but its story takes a detour through Xenia. Sometime before 1853, Xenia had a brewery known as the Xenia Brewery. A man named James Kyle bought it that year. He made substantial improvements to it and then sold it a year later to Henry Fernanding, the Dayton brewer, and a partner named Bernard Hollenkamp. Hollenkamp bought out Fernanding's interests in the Xenia Brewery in 1857, and he was Xenia's brewer until his death in 1872. His sons carried on the brewery for a few years, and Bernard's nephew, Theodore Hollenkamp, worked there for a few years before leaving for a brewery in Dayton. The Xenia Brewery seemed to fall into decline under subsequent owners, and it finally closed in 1905. The Theodore Hollenkamp had better luck in Dayton. In 1885, he bought a partnership in a small operation called the Ohio Brewery. He became sole owner 10 years later. When Theodore died in 1901, his family carried on the business, incorporating it as the Hollenkamp Brewing Company, and that's what you see here on the right. Local history buffs might remember the Hollenkamp Brewery as one of the few to survive Prohibition. It eventually morphed into the Dayton Brewing Company, the Dayton Brewing Corporation, and brewed Kitty Hawk line of beers as late as the 1960s. But I found that Hollenkamp also stands out as a woman-run brewery. After Theodore Sr. died in 1901, his widow, Anna, succeeded him as company president until her death in 1907. Their son, Theodore D. Hollenkamp, succeeded her, and he guided the company through Prohibition. But his sisters held executive positions. Anna L., the eldest sibling, was vice president from 1919 until Theodore died in she was vice president from 1919 until Theodore died in 1935, and then she succeeded him as president. Other Hollenkamp sisters served as treasurer and vice president. In fact, Hollenkamp women occupy most of the corporate officers' seats. As the world entered the 20th century, Dayton's brewers were feeling more and more pressure. Big brands such as Milwaukee's Joseph Schlitz Brewing Company in Milwaukee and Budweiser in St. Louis were coming into Dayton's market. New technology such as pasteurization and refrigerated rail cars extended their reach. At the same time, the Prohibition movement was gaining strength. Around the country, independent brewers in large cities were merging their operations together into combines. In Dayton, Adam Shantz Jr. picked up the reins from his father, who died in 1903. In February 1904, he announced a major brewery deal. In my book, I call it the Grand Consolidation. Initially, it included Adam Shantz Brewing, which owned the Riverside Brewery, Schwinn Brewing Company, which owned the Dayton View Brewery, Shantz and Schwinn, which owned the Gem City Brewery, Wenner Brewing, and Henry Fernanding's Old City Brewery, which was now owned by Jacob Stickle. Stickle was the only brewer in the initial deal who wasn't connected by family. But Nick Thomas joined the combine in 1906, and Dayton Brewing, the former Sachs Pruden Brewery, also eventually joined. Only the Hollenkamps stayed out. The new combine was called the Dayton Breweries Company. Adam Shantz Jr. was president, and its headquarters was one of the original tenants of the brand new arcade. Four families intertwined by marriage dominated the new company: the Shantzes, the Schwinns, the Wenners, and the Olds. Now, let's talk about the Olds. The Olds had had connections with the Shantzes for at least half a century when Michael Old had mentored Adam Shantz in the meat business. By 1904, 4 Olt siblings were most deeply involved. Mary Eva Olt was married to Adam Shuntz Jr., the president of Dayton Breweries, and 3 of her brothers held positions or had worked for most of the combined breweries. But none of the Olts had ever owned their own brewery, and none held seats on the new company's board of directors. This might have influenced what happened next. In 1906, Charles, William, and Fred Olt broke away from Dayton Breweries to form their own, the Olt Brewing Company. 2 more brothers joined them. They built a new brewery on McGee Street between East 2nd and 3rd. I found no record of resistance or opposition to this breakaway by either the Dayton Breweries Company or by the various family members. But the Olt Brothers Brewing quickly seemed to find a niche in the Dayton beer market, and their flagship beer, Superba, became a popular hit. But here's what I wrote in my book. Dayton seemed to have plenty of thirsty palates, but times were about to change. Like an asteroid still far out in space, but in an orbit intersecting Earth's, prohibition was approaching. 2 world wars would rage, and men would walk on the moon before Dayton saw another new brewery. And today, little remains of all those old breweries. In fact, this building you see in this picture was one of the stables of the Olt Brewing Companies. It still exists there on Superba Court, but it's just a remnant, and unless you know the story of the Olt Brewing Company, I don't think you'd ever guess that this was anything but a fancy horse stable. National prohibition took hold in 1920. Dayton Breweries was already shrinking and closing individual breweries, and the enterprise collapsed in the 1920s. Most of Dayton's big breweries were torn down or converted to other uses. Only Nick Thomas's old brewery survived as the Miami Valley Brewing Company. It produced Nick Thomas, London Bobby, and Van Beck brands until the 1950s. Olt Brewery's Superba beer hung on until 1942, and you can still find Superba Court in East Dayton, where you can see this building. The Hollenkamps sold their brewery around 1940, and its successors kept brewing until the 1960s. But that was the end of brewing in Dayton until the craft beer movement revived it in the last decade. So that's all I've got for my talk. This is just a few points here where you can find my book. If you care to buy it, you can find it at Barnes & Noble booksellers or at Carillon Historical Park, either in their gift shop or at Carillon Brewing. They should have some there at the counter. You can also find it online at Amazon.com. I don't have many appearances scheduled these days. I do have another Zoom book talk coming up on March 24th with the Miamisburg Historical Society. That will be focused entirely on the history of brewing here in Miamisburg. If you have any more questions, anything particular you want to contact me for, you can reach me by emailing DaytonBeerBook@gmail.com. And I am going to close this and go back to my regular screen.
Tim, you want to mention about your YouTube videos about the Miamisburg breweries too?
I don't have the URL in front of me. I did when the pandemic started. I was scheduled to give a book talk for the Miamisburg Historical Society back in March, I believe it was. Or April. And then we went into the lockdown. We had to cancel the book talk. So I decided I would produce a short video as a virtual book talk. Well, you know, without a lot else to do, stuck at home, I got kind of obsessive over it, and I ended up making a 5-part video series about Miamisburg's brewing history. It isn't the slickest thing ever produced. I was learning as I went, didn't have a lot of resources available, but I think if you search for my Dayton beer book on YouTube, or search Timothy R. Gaffney, or Miamisburg brewing history, you can probably find the videos there on YouTube and have a good laugh at my expense, if nothing else.
That's very good. Thanks, Tim. Is there any questions? Does anybody have any questions they would like to ask Tim? Unmute yourself, and if we got more than one at a time, I will hold somebody. Okay.
I've got a question.
All right,
Very
Jerry.
strange. How many breweries are in Dayton today?
You know what? That is a good question. At one time, I could have told you. At the time my book came out, I think I knew. I think it was around 17, but I've just completely lost count. There have been so many breweries open since my book came out. But to me, the most amazing thing, and especially given the lockdown we've been through and the, you know, all the difficulties everybody's been going through, it's amazing to me that most of these, just about all of these breweries are still open and still in business. That's pretty incredible.
This is what they call microbreweries now. I mean, as opposed
Right.
to, yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Tim, do you know how many gallons of beer was brewed during this period of time that you went through? Is there any history on that?
There are some numbers, and frankly, I haven't added it up because, you know, breweries operated at different times. So it's kind of hard to figure out what a total might have been at any given time. But I would say towards the end of the 19th century, early 1900s, you had a number of breweries in town, which I guess by local standards were large. And I don't know what they were actually selling, but various news articles and reports give their capacities. So Nick Thomas, for example, he just completed an expansion of his brewery around 1905, and he had about 150,000 barrel capacity. The Old Brewing Company was a relatively small brewery. When they started it, it had a capacity of about 25,000 barrels. Now,
Much as
those
a
would all
barrel.
be really
Yeah.
good sized breweries for a microbrewery today.
Tim, how big is a barrel?
A
How many
barrel,
gallons?
I believe it's about, I don't like to guess, but I believe it's around 30 gallons, very roughly, 30,
Okay.
35 gallons. If anybody out there knows, I'm not quite, you know, this is one of those things I probably knew a couple of years ago, but I'm not sure exactly how many gallons is in a beer barrel, but I think it's around 30 gallons.
Okay. Is there any other questions?
Yeah, Tim, what's the shelf life of the brews back then of a barrel?
What is the shelf life? My understanding is that these beers did not keep, especially the ales and the porters. And so, especially in before the late 1800s, breweries were very much local, which is why you tended to have all these small neighborhood breweries. The beer didn't keep, it had to be consumed pretty quickly. It didn't travel well. And so breweries mainly either sold directly to the people who lived around them or to the local saloons. That was something I didn't get into tonight, but I talk about it in my book, which is the saloons were a very big part of the brewing business back then. In fact, it was common for a brewery to either own local saloons or own the building and lease the building to a saloon operator. And often the terms of the lease required the saloonist to buy all his beer from that brewer. One of the things that happened, one of the reasons why all these families got together and formed the big combine, the Dayton Breweries Company, was because so many of these saloons were basically so bad and causing so much trouble in their neighborhoods that was one of the things that was driving the prohibition movement. So the Dayton Breweries Company, when they pooled all their resources, they went out and bought up breweries all over Dayton, and the ones that were causing trouble, they shut them down. They either straightened them up or they just shut them down completely. So they were really trying not just to control the market, but they were also trying to head off the prohibition movement, at least in Dayton.
Jerry Strange again. When I was growing up, the main beers in Dayton in the 50s, I would say, were Hudipole, Wiedemann, and Berger, all out of Cincinnati.
Right.
I don't remember any real, I mean, there were national beers, but they were the real dominant beers in the Dayton area in the 50s. Would you agree with that? Or, I mean, do you have any, in your research, did you find out when the Cincinnati beers moved into the Dayton market?
The Cincinnati beers or the national beers?
The Cincinnati beers. You know, like Berger sponsored the Reds games for years and years and years, and
Right.
Hudipole was a real big beer.
You know, I don't have that much information about the Cincinnati beers coming in the Dayton market, but one of the things that did happen was the Cincinnati brewers helped pollinate the rest of the Miami Valley. A lot of the brewers that we saw here in Dayton and brew masters started out down in Cincinnati, and some of them would start in Dayton and then go down and work for a while in one of the Cincinnati breweries and then come back. One of the breweries I didn't get a chance to talk to about tonight was the brewery up in Minster, because Minster is this little village of just like 2,000 people up in Auglaize County. But at one time, it had one of the biggest breweries around. And some of you probably know the name Wooden Shoe Brewery. It was originally built as the Star Brewery back in 1869, but it became so popular, the Wooden Shoe beer that it brewed became so popular by the 1930s after Prohibition that the company changed its name to Wooden Shoe Brewing. But the brewmaster, the first brewmaster there, started out working for Wiedemann down in Cincinnati. What was his name? Joseph Wiedemann? I forget his name. But he worked in his brewery in the 1870s before coming up to Minster and becoming the brewmaster there for quite a few years. So there was a lot of cross-pollination going on, and the big breweries down in Cincinnati helped a lot with the success of the breweries up through the rest of the Miami Valley. Let me add too, though, you were asking about the big brands. By the turn of the century, around 1900, 1901, you started seeing ads in the local newspapers and local, various local publications for, what was it, Schlitz out of Milwaukee, and also Budweiser out of St. Louis. Those started appearing, and that was one of the things I think that was really concerning the local brewers is they started coming into the local saloons, and that was a real threat to the Dayton brewers.
Thank you.
Are there any other questions? Well, Tim, I think we're getting close to the end of our time, and really thank you for presenting the program to us tonight. I think everyone enjoyed it, and everyone should look at your YouTube videos on the Miamisburg area to see what else happened in the brewing industry during that period of time. Again, for Centerville-Washington history, thank you very much for your presentation.
Okay, well, thanks for having me, and everybody stay safe out there, and might see you at the next book talk.
Thank you.